My name is George Adamson. I'm a kind of climate person in the department, in that I'm interested in climate and natural hazards from all kinds of different perspectives. One thing I'm very interested in is how we can understand climate in the past, but not using proxies, tree rings and what have you, but also looking at what people were writing about climate. And of course, what that means for the way that we understand climate change and the kind of risks associated with climate change. So yeah, that's my title of my presentation is Researching Climate Change Through Archives. So the field of research that we're talking about here is a defined field of research. It's called historical climatology. It was actually a field which was kind of developed by historians and geographers together, really back in the 1970s. Recently, increasingly become embedded within geography as a discipline. So there are three kind of aims of historical climatology and what it does, and I'm going to go through each of them in turn and have a think about some of the projects that your students might be interested in. So the first one is the more kind of physical science, reconstructing temporal and spatial patterns of weather and climate-related natural disasters. So we're talking droughts, floods, cyclones, etc. Generally for the period prior to the creation of national meteorological networks. So it grew as an academic discipline, people wanting to find out what the weather was doing before we had instruments that were recording it. But there's nothing to stop you looking at more recent. Also looking at the vulnerability of past societies and economies to climate variation, climate change. And probably the most interesting, I think, is the past discourses, social representations of climate. What did people think about their climate and weather in the past? And how is that different to the way that we appreciate and understand the environment that we're living in today? So the first question is, what can you use? Well, the answer is really anything. We've found records of people talking about the weather from ancient Buddhist texts from 2.5 centuries ago. And really, if anybody's writing anything down, they'll be writing about the weather. Newspapers definitely writing about the weather. Anybody's personal diaries. If that person is English or British, you can be pretty sure that they will write about the weather. I've done some work on colonial India, and the colonists in India were writing about the weather all the time. They were absolutely obsessed with it. It appeared in all of their letters home and their diaries, etc. Now, obviously, not all, well, most archives aren't open at the moment, and of course, we don't know when they're going to reopen, or if, of course, it would be considered safe to send your students to them anyway. Fortunately, there is a lot online. I've mentioned here the British newspaper archives from the British Library. These are fantastic records. So the British Library has a huge collection of newspapers in the English language, published all over the United Kingdom and Ireland, but also across what were Britain's colonies. So I said I've looked at India, Southern Africa, obviously North America, other parts of Africa, Australia. So your students can learn about the weather in different continents through looking at British newspapers. The archive is now searchable, which it wasn't when I did my PhD, which is, I kind of wish that it had been. It would have made my life a lot easier. But you can go into this record and you can, for example, say, well, I'm interested in 1900 through to 1950. I want to look at Cambridgeshire, and I'm interested in anybody talking about drought. So you can narrow that search and you can find every single reference to the term drought in newspapers that were published in Cambridge or in newspapers published elsewhere that were talking about Cambridge. There is apparently a school's access to the British newspaper archives. I can't tell you what the costings are or anything like that because I've never used it myself. I did just do a search earlier, and that there is an access for schools. Even if there isn't a free access, the payment to use the sources is unfortunately you do have to pay, but the charge is very low. So that's the newspaper archives, and they're absolutely wonderful. Private letters and diaries are great as well. Diaries give you a great kind of insight into people's personal relationships with the weather. So you will learn about, for example, whether someone thinks that the weather is giving them some kind of health problems. If you're looking at farmers' diaries, you'll learn a lot. Your students will learn a lot about the way that farming practices are affected by the weather, etc. Letters as well, particularly if it's a letter from someone who's living in a place which is not where they were brought up and they're writing home. So this is, of course, true of anything where you're interested in the historical geography of the British imperial period. People will always be writing about the weather because, of course, the weather was so unusual to them. Letters and diaries, it really depends on, and likewise the government records, whether they will be digitized or not depends on the archive. Some archives have been very good at digitizing. Some local archives have been very good at digitizing. Some have been much, much poorer. The funding landscape there is quite fragmented. So you really have to just look into the archives. The reason I drew a line on the local government records is because going into county archives, I think, would be a great thing for students to do. Because, of course, they're learning about their local history, which I'm sure is what most of them are interested in. Again, at the moment, we don't know. Some archives will be digitized, some won't. So that's a little bit open at the moment. But certainly when they reopen, they're fantastic resources. So first of all, I'll talk about reconstructing climate. Now, what you do in terms of reconstructing physical climate really depends on the data that you get. And this is one of the things that makes archival research such fun, because you have no idea what's going to come out. You might, if you're lucky, come out with something like what's hiding at the back here, which is a ship's log of a ship. I think they're in port somewhere in Gillingham. And every single day they are talking about, you have wind directions, and they're giving you, not even sure what these little symbols mean, but there's little conditions here. Sometimes you might get a description of a particular event that you can talk about. Here's a heat wave in Melbourne, but sometimes you get very vague. This says, you need practice to read the handwriting. It says raining, cold morning, left, and I think the place is called Mortheran at 5 past, etc. Essentially what they're saying is that it was raining very hard, and the path was only knee deep. So the path was knee deep. This is from Mauritius, which is why they say only knee deep, because they're expecting heavier rain than what they got. If you're unlucky, in fact, what usually happens when you don't have a kind of weather diary is you get all kinds of different records. You might have a newspaper article that says it was particularly dry this year. You may have a diary where someone's talking about the plants they have in their garden. You may have a letter where someone's talking about the rain in a particular week. There you have to use your judgment. Use something called content analysis. It's essentially a very simple form of quantifying qualitative data. So you take all of the records you have for, say, a particular year, and you rank it. And you can see I've given an example at the bottom here of rankings for rainfall over a year, a very dry year, fairly dry year, average wet year, and very wet year. This may seem incredibly coarse, and in a way it is, but once you map out these over time and you get a time series, you can say some quite interesting things about the degree of variability. Sometimes you can count things. So if you get a diary, someone's writing the days it rained, you could count the number of days it rained. You could maybe compare that to the number of days it rains at the moment in that particular location. A very strong student may be able to use regression and actually do a kind of correlation regression analysis and see when you count the number of rain days, what does that mean in terms of the amount of rain you have? But there's no need to go into that level of kind of mathematical detail if the student doesn't want to. If you are lucky and you get an instrumental record, this is an old weather diary for Durban that's available in I think it's the first weather records ever for that part of Southern Africa, 1850. The easiest piece of analysis that a student can do here is just compare it to modern weather. How is it similar? How is it different? Essentially, you're learning something about climate change here. Here it was mostly calm. It was relatively cool, probably for the compared to what it is at that time of year these days. That would be an interesting analysis for a student to do. And here, the old newspapers are particularly useful records because they did tend to publish in the days before television. This is where you would get your weather information in the newspapers. The next area is vulnerability and adaptation. What we're thinking about here is who is affected by some kind of weather pattern, or often you're talking about extreme weather events here, and how did they respond? So you might be interested in a particular period of climatic stress. 1816, for example, in the UK, called the Year Without a Summer. The Tambora eruption previous year meant that it was very cold and wet all summer, big famine all across Europe. You might be interested in the heavy winter of 1947 or 1963. You might be interested in the 1987 storm, or the famines that occurred across a lot of the tropics in 1877. So you can go into the archives, whatever they may be, and what I would advise a student to do in this situation is just look for what they can find about the famine and take some notes on it. Don't necessarily come in with a specific question. Come in with a set of questions and allow the specific question to emerge from the archives. So depending on the information you get, I've given some questions here about what the student may want to focus on. Who was vulnerable and who wasn't? For example, in this famine here in 1877, it's very clear that those who were the vast bulk of the populations in India were incredibly vulnerable. It was a horrible famine, whereas the colonists who were ultimately responsible for their upbringing, their upkeep, were protected because there was food being imported in just for the British, essentially. How did the hazard become a disaster? Might be an interesting question. Why was it that this particular drought led to a famine, whereas this one didn't? How did people respond? How did the institutions respond? Did government take a kind of parental line and try to protect the people that were under their control, or did they try to take a more laissez-faire and kind of let the markets respond? And did the event lead to any long-term changes in disaster response? For example, the 1947, the flood and then heavy winter changed the way that the Met Office approach risk and looking at risk. And this is probably my favorite because this is the one where you can have most fun. Narratives of climate. I've said narratives here of climate change. Now you can of course focus on climate change the way we understand it today, anthropogenic climate change. But you can also just look at climate and weather. How did people understand, live within and value their weather and their climate at different times of history? Students can be very creative here. You could ask questions such as, during X period, how did people understand the weather? What was important to them? What wasn't? What did they consider to be threatening or otherwise? What is different to today? So, for example, up until the end of the 19th century, there was an assumption that poor weather was responsible for bad health. For example, the malaria, the disease malaria comes from malaria, bad air. And that was generally, doctors, physicians basically believed that from the ancient Greeks right the way through to relatively recently. So how would have that affected the way that people responded to weather? And you can do that by looking at diaries, you can look at newspapers. Students, if they're interested, could take a more cultural approach and look at poems. How was the weather, English weather, written about in poems, or how did Charles Dickens write about the weather? So this is something I'm quite interested in at the moment, in a time where the climate change is causing weather change. I mean, the experience is down here in London, it's about 25, 26 degrees. It's very stuffy in here. It's incredibly unusual and unsettling, although very nice as well, for the end of May. So I've started to get quite interested in what do people think about weather in England? What does English weather mean to them? These are from a series of satirical cartoons from the early 19th century, kind of the Englishman's response to various different types of weather. Now, what I will say here is the archive doesn't just have to be something written. Oral history is very important here as well. So if your students are looking for something to do during lockdown, speaking to older people, for example, and asking them about their experiences, their memories of weather, I think are very important, because as the climate changes, weather changes, and we will be losing generations of people who can remember what the weather was like before the changes. So looking at that, or asking people about their experiences during a particular extreme event, would be just as useful as a piece of historical geography as actually going into an archive. So that was quite a kind of whistle-stop tour of historical climatology. I'm definitely available to give further advice. Do please get in touch with me. I'm going to leave my my email up here for a little bit. And does anybody have any questions?